Good morning, my dear friends. I hope you're all doing very well. Today we're going to be learning chapter 22 in the Rambam in the laws of Shabbat. We're going to be continuing to learn about the various restrictions that the rabbis have put in place in regards to Shabbat so that we should not, God forbid, come to desecrate it and do something which is forbidden. So, L'chaim, good morning. The Rambam begins in regards to Shabbat that we are not allowed to remove freshly baked bread on Shabbat from the oven. Back in the day, they would have an oven that they would stick the breads to the sides. It was like a tall oven, an open hole, and there was heat, and they would stick these flat pita breads to the walls, and you would have to shave them off the walls. So that we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. Unless in a case where a person baked them before Shabbat, forgot to take them out, and now Shabbat begins and he doesn't have any food, so the rabbis say that you're allowed to take out just enough the amount that you need for Shabbat. But anything extra is you're actually preparing, you're taking it and you're getting it ready to be used on a weekday, which is not allowed. So that's in regards to the idea of baking. Now in regards to taking a shower or washing oneself on Shabbat, that is also something which we're not allowed to do on Shabbat, because very simple reason, it's all based on logic. A person, if we would let a person wash themselves on Shabbat with hot water, they might heat up the hot water. They might go and light a fire and heat up hot water on Shabbat in order to take a hot bath if we let them do it. So therefore the rabbi said, better don't take any hot baths whatsoever, and then we'll be good. But if a person wants to go and sit next to a hot fire and warm up, that's fine. But don't get yourself wet with cold water and then go to the fire and heat up the water on you, because then, again, it's still similar to taking a hot bath because the water is going to heat itself up. So that's no good. But if it's a natural hot spring, well then, that's just a natural hot spring. It's like jumping into the ocean, which is allowed on Shabbat. Now, how about if a person takes a cup of water or a pitcher of water or a big jug and the water is freezing cold and he wants to put it next to a furnace or next to a fire so that it should not heat up, but it should not be freezing cold. That is something which is allowed, but we're not allowed to put it so close that the water should actually start getting boiling hot, because that, again, is something which we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. And so much so that if we even have a bathtub full of boiling hot water, we're not allowed to pour some cold water in it, because we are then going to heat up that cold water. It's going to become heated up by the other hot water next to it. But if it's just a little bit of hot water and a little bit of cold water, so then we are allowed to mix that. But the other way around, if you have a big bathtub full of cold water, you're allowed to pour some hot water in it, because you're not going to boil up this cold water with just a little bit of hot water into it. All right. On Shabbat, we are not we are allowed to heat up something in the sun on Shabbat, because you can't make a mistake with this. The sun is natural. You're not doing anything. You're just putting something outside. And that's something which you're allowed to do. So you're allowed to put something into a place which is naturally warm to keep it warm, that it should be safe, that it should be good, that it shouldn't get freezing cold. Maybe he says you're allowed to place a dish of cooked food into a well, where it's very locked in and it's a good place to preserve it. That's something which is allowed to be done. We are not allowed to pickle something on Shabbat. So now we're talking about food. Pickling, to take something and to put it into take fish or something else, whatever it might be, to pickle the food. You're not allowed to prepare herring on Shabbat, for instance. You have to do it before. But you're allowed to create dressings of, mixing of various foods. For instance, if you want to mix water, salt, and oil so that you can have like a dip for your food, that is fine. But don't make too much of it so that you're not preparing for the week. You're just doing it for Shabbat. How about mustard? Mustard that has been created before Shabbat, and you've mixed it on Friday, but now when it comes to Shabbat, it became a little bit hard, and you want to blend it, you want to use it, you want to get it all nice and ready to eat. That is allowed because it's already been prepared essentially before Shabbat. The next law which we're talking about over here is that a person is not allowed to cut their hair on Shabbat. As we know, we're not allowed to take a haircut on Shabbat. So therefore, a person is not allowed to either smear a certain substance which will make their hair fall off, or so much so that it says that a person shouldn't look into a metal mirror that has like sharp edges, and to look at into this mirror, to look at themselves, because maybe they'll find a strand of hair that is, in a weird spot, and they'll want to pull it out, or rather cut it off with the sharp ends of the mirror, and that is something which we're not allowed to do. But if it's just a regular mirror, just a piece of glass or whatever, so then we're not worried about it. So therefore, no worries. You are allowed to look into a mirror on Shabbat. That's not an issue. We are not allowed to do laundry on Shabbat. We're not allowed to whiten clothing, to clean them in a fashion of laundry. So therefore, a person who has a bottle of water, let's say, and now wants to stuff the cork, doesn't have the cork, so he'll take a piece of material and stick it into the hole. That is a problem, because essentially you're going to be cleaning this piece of material, whatever, garment it is. So to also, we have to be very careful not to squeeze wet material, and therefore if you want to wash your dishes on Shabbat, you have to be very careful, because you don't want to just use a regular sponge, because when you squeeze that sponge, you're squeezing the water out of that material. So therefore, the right way to do it is to have a sponge that is not squeezable. It's just like these little spikes of plastic or whatever, and no water can actually get into them, and then you can just wash your dishes and it's not a problem. If a person has a cask, like a big barrel full of wine for Shabbat, and what happens is it broke, and now all the wine is spilling all over the place, and you're trying to save it because it's good wine, you're only allowed to save enough wine that you need for Shabbat. Because again, you shouldn't be preparing on Shabbat for during the week. And so you're allowed to do that. And if you have more guests, then you can save more. But if you don't have so many people eating or drinking wine in the house, so then you're only allowed to take for whatever you need. If a person's clothing gets dirty, so you're allowed to rub off from behind the other side of the material, you're allowed to rub it so that the dirt should get off and should become cleaned. But we're not allowed to actually launder it and sponge down and get it all cleaned up, because that's something which we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. Okay, how about a shoe? Your shoe got dirty on Shabbat and you want to have it clean. You're not allowed to actually go and wipe your shoe to get it clean, but you're allowed to you're allowed to rub it in water, just to shake your shoe a little bit in the water, and then the dirt will fall off. That's something which is allowed. So to also in regards to cleaning our hands, which became dirty on Shabbat, we should be careful that we should do it not in the same way as our everyday practice, because maybe we will then take this dirty cloth, if our hands became full of mud, and now go and wash it after we're done, which is a problem. Okay, someone whose clothing became wet on Shabbat. So a person falls into the lake on Shabbat and now sopping wet. What do we do now? This person is allowed to walk around with their clothing, even though maybe he's going to be squeezing some of it as he walks, because squeezing is a problem. But when we just use this person just walking around, they're normally regular, even though his clothes are wet, we will say that it's a problem. That is not a problem, and it's fine. But you're not allowed to take them off and hang them up, because again, we have a problem with that, because maybe someone is going to see hanging outside your window on your clothing line, your wet clothes, and they'll say, hey, he's doing laundry on Shabbat. That's not allowed. So therefore, we're not allowed to do that. And the Rambam gives a general idea that whenever the sages said that there is a prohibition because of the impression that it might make on others, that act is also forbidden, even in one's private room where no one might see it, but still, the prohibition is still in effect. Okay, a person is not allowed to dye or paint on Shabbat, so therefore we're not allowed to apply makeup on Shabbat. The woman is not allowed to put makeup on Shabbat. And tearing is also something which is not allowed to be done on Shabbat. So therefore a person whose clothing gets stuck in the thorns, so then you got to be very careful while taking it out because you don't want to rip it. But he says that if you have brand new clothing which you haven't really tried on yet, and maybe they'll, if it's a little bit too small and you'll put it on, it might tear, we're not worried. Hopefully you bought it according to the right size and it should be okay. We are not allowed to braid here on Shabbat. Why not? Because on Shabbat we're not allowed to build. And therefore, braiding is resembling the idea of building. You're putting together, you're taking braiding, you're taking various strands and you're putting it together, you're creating a new art. So that's something which we would not be allowed to do on Shabbat. And the chapter finishes off over here in regards to making a tent. Building a tent on Shabbat, erecting a tent on Shabbat is something which we're not allowed to do. So therefore, we have to be careful. We're not allowed to just take poles and hang stuff on material on top of it in order to make a tent. That's something which we're not allowed to do. So much so that the Rambam says a special permission, so to speak. It is, he says, not a problem. This is permitted. You're allowed to wear a hat with a very wide brim, and it gives you a lot of shade. So that's allowed. But for instance, interesting. He says if you have a big barrel, I don't know if it's full or empty, but to take a cloth and cover over it, over the top of the barrel, that is actually making a tent. And that's something which you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. So that's something which you can do. But just to use a regular cover, that is okay. So that is the idea of the not creating tents on Shabbat, something which we are not allowed to do. That is chapter 21 of the Laws of Shabbat. Hope you enjoyed it. We will see you all tomorrow.